In 1998, I remember hearing that Tammy Wynette had died. The news reported it as a blood clot, a sad but natural end for country music's first lady. What they didn't tell us was that her daughters would spend the next 2 decades fighting for justice, convinced their mother's death wasn't what it seemed. They didn't tell us about the doctor who gave her 1,500 painkiller injections, or the husband who allegedly controlled her every move. The woman who sang about standing by your man was living a life dramatically different from her public image. This is the story of Tammy Wynette's final years, a tale of pain, addiction, exploitation, and questions that remain unanswered to this day. To understand the tragedy of Tammy Wynette's final years, we need to go back to the beginning of her health struggles. While Tammy projected strength on stage, her body was quietly betraying her from a young age. What started as occasional pain would eventually spiral into a medical nightmare that dominated the last 2 decades of her life. Tammy's health problems began in earnest during the 1970s with severe abdominal pain. This led to the first of what would become 26 major surgeries throughout her lifetime. She underwent multiple operations for issues ranging from intestinal blockages to gynecological problems, each one taking a greater toll on her body. In 1978, complications from gallbladder surgery led to a bile duct obstruction, beginning a cycle of medical interventions that would never truly end. The pain from these procedures was intense, requiring increasingly powerful medications. Despite these health challenges, Tammy maintained a grueling performance schedule. Country music historian Robert K. Ehrman noted, "She was on the road constantly, sometimes performing 150 shows a year. Most people with her medical issues would have been bedridden, but Tammy kept going." By the early 1980s, Tammy was experiencing chronic inflammation of the bile ducts, a condition called cholangitis. During one particularly severe episode in 1986, she was admitted to the Betty Ford Center. Tammy herself addressed this in her autobiography, writing, "I had a pain problem, not a drug problem." This distinction would become increasingly blurred as the years went on. The 1980s also brought respiratory problems, including pneumonia and chronic bronchitis. She began carrying an oxygen tank with her on tour, using it between performances. Fans rarely saw this side of her. The moment she stepped off stage, she would often collapse in exhaustion, only to somehow find the strength to perform again the next night. Former band member George Ritchie Jr. recalled in a 2010 interview, "She would be in absolute agony backstage, barely able to stand. Then the intro music would start, and she'd transform. She'd walk out there and give everything to the audience. They never knew what it cost her." This pattern of pushing through pain became Tammy's normal. Each medical intervention seemed to create new complications, requiring more treatments and more medications. By the late 1980s, she was regularly taking powerful prescription painkillers just to function. As the 1990s began, Tammy's health would deteriorate further, leading her into the care of a controversial doctor whose treatments would raise serious questions about medical ethics. The woman who sang about standing by your man was increasingly dependent on others to make decisions about her health, decisions that would have devastating consequences. In 1990s, Tammy Wynette's medical care took a troubling turn when she began treatment with Dr. Wallace Marsh, a Pittsburgh physician who would become a central figure in the final years of her life. Dr. Marsh's unconventional treatment methods and the volume of medications he prescribed have raised serious questions about medical ethics. According to court documents filed after Tammy's death, Dr. Marsh administered more than 1,500 narcotic injections to the singer over a 4-year period. These injections, primarily Demerol, Dilaudid, and other powerful opioids, were often given daily, sometimes multiple times per day. Most alarmingly, many were administered not in a medical facility, but in Tammy's home, on her tour bus, or in hotel rooms. Jackie Daly, Tammy's daughter, later told the Tennessean, "My mother was getting injections morning, noon, and night. Sometimes she'd be so sedated she couldn't even hold her head up, but they'd still put her on stage." This level of medication would be concerning for any patient, but for a performer expected to maintain a busy schedule, it raises serious questions about who was looking out for Tammy's best interests. Dr. Marsh also implanted a Hickman catheter, a central venous line, directly into Tammy's chest. This permanent port allowed for easier administration of medications, but also created new risks of infection. The catheter remained in place for years, an unusually long time for such a device. What makes Dr. Marsh's involvement particularly troubling is that he wasn't just Tammy's physician. He became deeply involved in her personal and professional life. He frequently traveled with her, administering medications before and after performances. According to former band members, Dr. Marsh would often determine whether Tammy was well enough to perform. Medical experts who later reviewed Tammy's treatment history expressed alarm. Dr. Harold J. Burstein, a Harvard Medical School physician who reviewed the case, stated, "The quantity of narcotics prescribed was extraordinary and well beyond what would be considered appropriate pain management, even for a patient with serious chronic pain." By 97, just a year before her death, Tammy's physical condition had deteriorated significantly. She had lost weight, appeared disoriented during interviews, and sometimes struggled to complete performances. Yet the medication regimen continued, with Dr. Marsh remaining a constant presence in her life. As troubling as Tammy's medical situation was, it wasn't the only strange chapter in her later years. Years earlier, a bizarre incident had already raised questions about the narrative being presented to the public, an alleged kidnapping that many now believe never actually happened the way it was reported. On October 4, 1978, headlines across America reported shocking news. Country music star Tammy Wynette had been kidnapped from a Nashville shopping center, driven 80 miles in her luxury car, physically assaulted, and then abandoned on a rural road. The story, as initially told by Tammy and her then-husband George Ritchie, was dramatic and terrifying. But over the years, serious questions have emerged about what really happened that day. According to the original account, Tammy was shopping when a man with dirty blonde hair and a Texas drawl forced her at gunpoint into her car. The kidnapper allegedly drove her to a wooded area, physically assaulted her, and then left her on the side of the road. Tammy said she managed to flag down a passing motorist who helped her contact police. Almost immediately, inconsistencies in the story began to emerge. No witnesses at the busy shopping center reported seeing the abduction. The Nashville police noted that Tammy had refused their offer to pursue the case, saying she was too traumatized to help with the investigation. Perhaps most tellingly, she declined to file formal charges or work with a police sketch artist. Jimmy McDonough, in his 2010 biography, Tammy Wynette, Tragic Country Queen, uncovered more troubling details. Multiple sources close to Tammy, including her former husband George Jones, expressed skepticism about the kidnapping. McDonough quotes Jones as saying, "I don't think that ever happened. I think it was a publicity stunt." Dottie West, a close friend and fellow country star, reportedly said that Tammy later confessed the kidnapping was fabricated. According to West, Tammy admitted that the bruises on her face came not from an abduction, but from domestic violence. This allegation has never been definitively proven, but it adds another disturbing layer to an already mysterious incident. Georgette Jones, Tammy's daughter with George Jones, wrote in her memoir, The Three of Us, that she had doubts about the kidnapping story from the beginning. "There were too many things that didn't add up," she wrote, and it seemed to give George Ritchie even more reason to protect Mom by controlling who she saw and what she did. This perception would play directly into her relationship with her final husband, George Ritchie, whose role in Tammy's life would become increasingly controversial as her health declined and her dependence on pain medication grew. In 1978, Tammy Wynette married George Ritchie, her fifth and final husband. Ritchie, who had previously worked as her road manager, would remain by her side until her death 20 years later. While Tammy publicly portrayed their relationship as loving and supportive, allegations from family members and close associates paint a much darker picture. Ritchie came into Tammy's life at a vulnerable time. Her legendary but tumultuous marriage to George Jones had ended, her health problems were escalating, and her career was beginning to show signs of decline. According to Jimmy McDonough's biography, Ritchie positioned himself as Tammy's protector, someone who could manage both her career and her increasingly complicated personal life. Jackie Daly, Tammy's daughter, later claimed in court documents that Ritchie exercised almost total control over every aspect of Tammy Wynette's life. This control allegedly extended to who Tammy could see, when she could speak to her children, and even what medical treatments she received. According to Daly, Richie would often screen Tammy's phone calls and limit family visits, gradually isolating her from those who had been closest to her. Perhaps most concerning were the financial arrangements. After their marriage, Richie became not just Tammy's husband, but her manager, giving him control over both her personal finances and career decisions. This dual role created what some have described as a conflict of interest, especially as Tammy's health declined and she became more dependent on medications that affected her judgment. Georgette Jones wrote in her memoir that Richie seemed more interested in keeping Tammy performing than in her well-being. Mom would be sick, almost unable to stand, but George would insist she could make it through one more show. There was always one more show. The relationship between Richie and Dr. Wallace Marsh has also come under scrutiny. According to court documents, Richie not only approved of the extensive medication regimen, but actively facilitated it. This unusual arrangement created a situation where the two men most responsible for Tammy's care were also those who benefited financially from her continued performing. In the final years of Tammy's life, her appearance and behavior changed dramatically. Once vibrant and engaging, she became thin, often appeared disoriented, and struggled to complete interviews. These circumstances would ultimately set the stage for the tragic and controversial end to Tammy's life. On April 6, 1998, Tammy Wynette was found unresponsive in her Nashville home. She was 55 years old. The initial cause of death was reported as a blood clot to the lungs, and the country music world mourned the loss of one of its greatest stars. However, what seemed like a straightforward, if tragic end, would soon become the subject of intense controversy and legal battles. The official story, as initially reported by George Richie and accepted by medical authorities, was that Tammy had died of natural causes related to her long-standing health problems. The death certificate listed the cause as a cardiac arrhythmia. Given Tammy's extensive medical history, few questioned this explanation at first. However, as Tammy's daughters began to review the circumstances surrounding their mother's death, they discovered troubling inconsistencies. According to court documents later filed by the family, no autopsy was performed on Tammy's body, an unusual omission for someone with her complex medical history who died suddenly at home. Even more concerning, the family alleged that Richie had Tammy's body embalmed within hours of her death before a thorough investigation could be conducted. In '99, just over a year after Tammy's death, her daughters took the extraordinary step of having her body exhumed for an independent autopsy. The results were inconclusive due to the embalming process, but the medical examiner noted that the presence of certain drugs could not be ruled out as contributing factors in her death. The family's suspicions led to a wrongful death lawsuit filed against George Richie and Dr. Wallace Marsh in 2000. The lawsuit alleged that the two men had been negligent in their care of Tammy, administering dangerous combinations of medications without proper monitoring or safeguards. Perhaps most shocking were allegations that Tammy had been kept on a Richie schedule, a regimen of medications designed to keep her functional for performances, but which may have ultimately contributed to her death. The legal battle never reached a full trial. In 2002, the parties reached a confidential settlement that included changing Tammy's death certificate. The new cause of death was listed as cardiac arrhythmia due to cardiac dysrhythmia due to unknown cause, with a significant contributing factor being reaction to multiple drug interaction. This change acknowledged that medications likely played a role in Tammy's death. The settlement of the wrongful death lawsuit in 2002 was not the end of the legal battles surrounding Tammy Wynette's estate and legacy. In the years following her death, a complex web of disputes emerged involving her daughters, George Richie, and various business entities that controlled her music and image. One of the most contentious issues involved the rights to Tammy's name and likeness. Shortly after her death, Richie sold the intellectual property rights to Tammy's name, image, and recordings to a company called Sheridan Broadcasting for a reported $4 million. This transaction occurred without consultation with Tammy's daughters, who were shocked to discover that they no longer had control over how their mother's name and image were used. Georgette Jones described the pain this caused in her memoir. "It was like losing Mom all over again. We couldn't even use her name, our own mother's name, without permission from strangers who had purchased it." This situation created the bizarre circumstance where Tammy's own children had to seek permission to use the name Tammy Wynette in connection with any public events or memorials. The daughters also discovered that despite Tammy's successful career spanning decades, her estate was surprisingly modest. Questions arose about the management of her finances during her final years, with allegations that Ritchie had mishandled or misappropriated funds. In 2010, more than a decade after Tammy's death, her daughters reached an agreement with the companies that owned her intellectual property rights. This agreement gave the family more input into how Tammy's legacy would be managed going forward, though they still did not regain full control of her name and image. George Ritchie remained largely silent about these controversies until his death in 2010. He remarried shortly after Tammy's passing and maintained until the end that he had always acted in Tammy's best interests. Today, more than 2 decades after her death, Tammy's daughters continue to advocate for a more complete understanding of their mother's life and struggles. They have spoken openly about the contrast between her public image and private reality, hoping that by acknowledging the full truth of her story, fans can appreciate not just her musical talent, but her extraordinary resilience. The story of Tammy Wynette's final years reveals a profound and troubling disconnect between public image and private reality. On stage, she was the first lady of country music, the woman who sang about standing by your man with unwavering strength. Behind the scenes, she was battling chronic pain, addiction, and relationships that many close to her described as controlling and exploitative. This contrast speaks to a broader issue in how we treat our entertainment icons. We expect them to perform through pain, to maintain appearances regardless of personal cost, and to embody the personas they've created even when those personas no longer reflect their lived experience. Tammy's continued performances despite serious health issues weren't just a testament to her dedication. They were a reflection of an industry that often values the product over the person. The medical aspects of Tammy's story raise important questions about the ethics of celebrity healthcare. When doctors become part of a celebrity's entourage, the lines between medical professional and enabler can blur. DeMarsh's treatment of Tammy, 1,500 injections over 4 years, often administered in non-medical settings, represents an extreme example of how standard medical practices can be abandoned when the patient is a valuable commodity. Perhaps most poignantly, Tammy's story highlights how even the most successful women in country music have often found themselves with less control over their lives and careers than their public image would suggest. From her early marriages to her final years with George Ritchie, Tammy's life was shaped by relationships with men who exerted significant influence over her personal and professional choices. Even after death, the battle over her name, image, and legacy continued this pattern of control. Yet despite these troubling aspects, Tammy Wynette's resilience remains remarkable. Through 26 major surgeries, chronic pain, and personal struggles, she continued to create music that resonated with millions. Songs like Stand By Your Man, Divorce, Until I Can Make It On My Own remain powerful expressions of female experience, regardless of the complexities of the woman who sang them. As we look back on Tammy's life and career, perhaps the most fitting tribute is not to sanitize her story or to sensationalize its darker elements, but to acknowledge the full truth of who she was, a talented, complicated woman who gave voice to the experiences of countless others while struggling with her own demons. By recognizing both her extraordinary gifts and her very human vulnerabilities, we honor not just the legend, but the real woman behind it. In the end, the dark truth about Tammy Wynette's final years isn't just a cautionary tale about fame, addiction, or exploitation, though it is certainly all of those things. It's also a reminder that behind every iconic performance, every perfect recording, and every carefully crafted public image is a real person with real struggles. By acknowledging those struggles alongside her triumphs, we gain a more complete understanding of Tammy Wynette's legacy, not just as country music's first lady, but as a woman whose strength was evident not in the absence of suffering, but in her ability to create beauty despite it.